All right, so the first lecture here today is going to be on kind of just a background primer on the climate health science, and then slowly how we tie that into health. So this is hopefully going to get everyone to kind of a background starting information. Some of you may already know all this stuff. That's great. I just want to get everyone kind of on the same format going forward. So let's see. So kind of objectives for this is going to be just talking about what is the reality of climate science? Is it real? Is it a hoax? What's going on? And hopefully kind of some background on why people think the way they do and what the kind of mechanisms are for how our planet's warming. To do that, we'll also address like the carbon cycle, kind of historical features of the carbon cycle and where we are today and how this relates to the warming of our planet. And when we think of like the warming of our planet, or you call it global warming or climate change, I want to kind of present the concept of kind of a generalized, energized planet. So it's more energy that's gone into the system and what the ramifications of that are. We'll kind of blend in how climate change and health overlap and blend and kind of mix together. And then we'll talk about kind of solutions and strategies, just starting to open some options and show that there is hope on this and we have options. And in a sense, seeing this is like, right, understanding climate science is the same as like our pathophysiology we learn for patients. And so if you understand the pathophys, you understand the medicines and the disease process, there are ways to establish treatments, and you can understand how, even though it may seem complicated, it will slow down and become more simple, understanding and being, well versed in kind of the background knowledge. So this is from the CDC. This is kind of what we're going to be covering in this whole course, right? We want to understand in the center of this diagram, right, the four main Earth system mechanisms that we're seeing: increased carbon dioxide levels, rising temperature, more extreme weather, and rising sea levels, and how those impact and then lead to changes, whether it's in infectious disease or respiratory illnesses, extreme heat, water and food supply. All these kind of interact and it kind of builds upon itself, but we want to start with understanding the core before we understand how it relates to health. So the first question is, does climate change exist? Absolutely, it's real, and people agree that it's real, but there's still people that don't understand it or don't believe it is real. And so I'm going to present kind of the information on how it's happening, why it's happening, the theories and what we're going with on this. But I also want to explain why people don't agree with this. So the Pew Research Center did a nice study and really kind of some in-depth questions with people who don't believe in climate change or don't believe that climate scientists agree on climate change. And some of the things, for us, it's understanding what those mindsets are, what those theories are, because then how can we engage or relate with the people that are not understanding the climate science and how it works. So some of the things that came out of that include those people don't necessarily believe in politicians and they don't believe in the media. They want clean air, they want clean water, but they don't want laws that kind of interfere with their freedom, and especially with an energy transition. So they don't want laws about new ICE vehicles. So when you hear me say ICE vehicles, I don't know if you guys have heard that term, ICE, that's an internal combustion vehicle or engine. So internal combustion engines are on gas or diesel as opposed to electric vehicles, which are on battery powers. If you hear ICE vehicles, that's a common vernacular used. These people believe that like climate change, we're just in a natural cycle and that humans are not the cause. They're okay with recycling, but they're concerned that if we do electric vehicles, that we're going to deplete the environment of resources that we live in. They're okay with the transition off fossil fuels, but they want it to be gradual. And they don't like hearing about the catastrophic or severity effects of climate change. They're definitely happy with local government programs, but they really don't like the federal government programs. And they must not have a financial burden placed upon them, and they want their freedoms protected. So these are some of kind of those theories of why, the doubters of climate science Those are kind of some of the things that they may or may not be able to be engaged in. We can talk about that too. So why is there a disconnect? So on the right, this is kind of a summary of 9 studies that looked amongst scientific agreement on whether humans have caused climate change. And if you look there, it's about 98 to 99% of scientists agree that humans have caused climate change. Now, on the other side, on the left side, you'll see a few of these graphs. They're from the Yale Public Health School. Great way you can like drop down menus and look at some stuff. But how many adults think that global warming is caused by humans? Only 58% of people in our country. So scientists think it is, but why is there this disconnect? And that's something that we have to do a better job with messaging. And that's where we come in, right? Healthcare providers and physicians and nurses are some of the most trusted sources against politicians, media, things like that. We are one of the more trusted sources. So if we can do a better job of reaching these people and messaging, this is where we can step up and be a part of it. And this, scientists agree on this more than doctors agree on tobacco causing lung cancer. So just as a perspective, like this is pretty well done as a debate. And people say like, well, is it really humans? But our fingerprints are all over this, right? We have, and the big difference we're going to talk about is starting in the Industrial Revolution, we started to consume and burn more fossil fuels. Before, we didn't really use them in a large scale, but at that point, we started using them for a large scale. And we can tell that these carbon that came from fossil fuels, now we're seeing it in the air, we're seeing it on trees, we're seeing it in the water, we're having less winter days, we're having more summer days. So our fingerprints are all over this is causing climate change. So historically, when did all this start? Well, theories of like planet warming or greenhouse gases, they started back over 170 years ago. And so it started, there was kind of this theory in the 1800s, okay, we are in space, which is really cold. How is our planet warm? Well, one of the first scientists who really looked at this was Eunice Foote, and she was a backyard home scientist. She didn't have money, didn't have a fancy research. She was doing this in her own house. And so she did an experiment where she took cylinders, as you can see in the picture, and she put thermometers in each of these cylinders. And then she put different types or different types of air in there. So some were wet air, some was like dry air, some was carbon dioxide. Some of the cylinders had oxygen in them. Some just had regular air, not hot or dry. And she put these cylinders with different gases in them in the window, and they wanted to see what the effect was. And so as she did this, she noted that just normal air in the cylinder went to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And when she did just carbon dioxide in it, it went to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And so she surmised that different gases and the percentages in our atmosphere could lead to different warming of the planet and the air around us. So it was kind of the initial study that looked at this. Now, because it was 1856 and the patriarchy and women weren't allowed to speak, she couldn't read her results at a conference and had to have a man read her results, which is very frustrating. But she did get it published in the Scientific American when it came out. Further research happened like in 3 years later. John Tyndall, who sometimes gets to be known as the father of greenhouse gases and the first research, he probably stole some of the ideas from her or knew about her research, but he had money and a resource lab and research assistants, so he was able to put it into a bigger scale. But we've known about this concept of greenhouse gases, and it's been refined over the years, but we've known about this for about 170 years and the warming effect. So when we talk about this, what is this greenhouse gas effect? And you probably all have heard about this, but the sun radiates energy to our planet. A lot of that is reflected off of the planet and then is released into space. Some of that is held back, and the greenhouse gases are kind of those reflectors that are reflecting some of that heat back into our atmosphere, and that keeps us at a temperature that we're able to be accustomed to. We're not a cold planet. We're not an extensively hot planet, but we're getting there. Now, if you add more greenhouse gases to this, to our atmosphere, more of that solar radiation will be trapped in our atmosphere and does not get released into space. And this is what we're seeing with the warming. So where's all this carbon coming from, and who are these greenhouse gases, and what do they mean? What is all this? So greenhouse gases, when we talk about them, are usually four main ones. So carbon dioxide, methane, which is natural gas, they're used interchangeably, ozone, which is O3, and nitric oxides. So ozone, you've probably, in the 1980s and 90s, we were hearing there's holes in the ozone layer. That's a same material, but in different locations. So there's a high upper level ozone, and then what we care about is a lower level ozone, and you'll hear about that. So ground zone or low zone ozone is stuff that's produced from volatile organic compounds and heat, and you mix that with some oxygen and you get ozone. That's in a sense part of air pollution or smog. So when you hear ozone, a lot of that goes along with smog. So if you hear that, smog is kind of a blending of different things. But methane, that's coming from farm and dairy products, as well as decomposition in landfills of organic materials, as well as release from like natural gas or oil drilling. And then nitric oxides comes from animal waste and fertilizer production. So each of these greenhouse gases has a different greenhouse gas potential for in terms of warming. So I put some numbers on here you can see. Now these are approximate. Some people will say it's higher, some people will say it's lower. Methane maybe 25 times as much as carbon dioxide. But some of these gases also break down way faster. So you have to take into the life cycle of the gas, how long it lasts, how long it breaks down, but also the warming potential that each of those gases have. We use carbon or carbon dioxide as an equivalent because that's kind of like our base standard currency. So you'll hear people talk about their carbon footprint or carbon dioxide or CO2 units, because we use that as kind of a standard measuring, but know that these also have a relation to that measuring unit. So where are we using these greenhouse gases? Where are they coming from? And this is kind of looking by major sectors of our usage as humans. So the number one is going to be electricity and heat generation. And we say heat, some people say, well, I have a electric furnace or something. Heat is also, some people have coal or oil or natural gas-based heating for their house. And this sector is actually increasing too, because electricity, if we're doing a lot more electrical additions to our grid, or our need as society has increased in terms of the amount of electricity we're using, this is actually increasing as a percentage. Agriculture and land use is a big percentage of greenhouse gases. Industry, and when you hear industry, some of the big ones are going to be cement, steel, and fertilizer production. And the reason those are high is because they have a huge amount of heat that is required for the process of making that material. And so we use greenhouse gases, or we use fossil fuels to do these industries, because fossil fuels are one of the most dense transportable energy source per kilogram of any other things that we have. You can't burn enough trees to create the same heat that you need to create steel or cement. So you're using coal or oil to get to that high temperature that's needed, that energy input. And it's transportable, right? You can put coal or oil in somewhere, transport it, and then use it at a different area. So that's why we've been using these since the Industrial Revolution. And that's kind of how we're trying to overcome it, say with batteries or other things. But batteries are nowhere near the same density of energy per kilogram that like coal and oil have. And then transportation is the last major sector, which is a big issue here in Arizona. So in Arizona, our greenhouse gases mainly come from electricity, which is about 40%, 40 to 45%. And then transportation is the other major factor at 40 to 45%. So if you took all greenhouse gas emissions in Arizona, 90% come from electricity and transportation. So if we take that and we say, all right, let me know about this carbon cycle and how that's relating to our greenhouse gases and where they're coming from. So there's three kind of branches with the carbon cycle. Let's just talk about the land branches. So if we talk about land, where does carbon come from? Well, carbon is sequestered, right? CO2 is sequestered by plants during photosynthesis and goes into the structure of the plant. And then as that plant breaks down, that carbon dioxide is re-released back into the atmosphere and then sucked up by another plant and put into it. Those plants also take some of that carbon dioxide and store it into the ground. So our soil is a huge sink for carbon dioxide. And when those plants are cut down, say in a change of land use, maybe deforestation, maybe I till a field or I turn it into houses, you lose not just the carbon that was stored in those plants, but you lose the storage that was there in the soil as well. So your land is a huge sink. The other big sink that we have for carbon is oceans. So oceans constantly take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but also release carbon dioxide. They're a constant, it's like its own membrane and moving back and forth. Over time, some of that carbon dioxide that gets sequestered into oceans in terms of plant life or animals can go deep into the ocean when they die and decompose, and some of that carbon can get sunk in the bottom of the ocean as a fixed storage as well. Now, oceans, in that, like some people are looking at new techs where maybe I grow a bunch of seaweed, I harvest it, I then bury it and drop it deep into the ocean, and that may be a carbon storage technique to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. And so they're using kind of the oceans as a sink, but they are a huge storage as well. Coral reefs are huge storage of carbon in the form of calcium carbonate, and losing coral reefs is also a problem because that's releasing carbon back into the atmosphere. The third part of the carbon cycle is fossil fuels. So they are sequestration of carbon from a long time ago, right? It's very dense carbon, whether it's coal or oil or natural gas, that's been underground for a prolonged period of time. But this is only a one-way release. When we're burning or consuming fossil fuels, we are removing them from the ground and we are releasing it back into the atmosphere. But we're not creating new carbon and putting it back into fossil fuels. Now, you could argue that some of the new carbon sequestration techniques, so if you guys have ever heard of carbon capture, that goes along. There's a lot of tech that's trying to look at carbon capture, which is machines that would take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, turn it into a liquid or more solid form, and then bury that back under the planet, maybe back into a coal mine, maybe back into a used oil well or something that no longer is producing. And that's a way of carbon storing. The issue with those is you have to generate that to run those plants. You have to have clean electricity from renewable sources. Otherwise, you're just burning more fossil fuels to then capture fossil fuels. So you have to make sure that carbon cycle is working the right way. When we talk about the vegetation, if you look in the bottom side of this, when we talk about soil and root systems as storage of carbon is huge, right? So the graph, the circles on the top, the hemicircles, is showing how much carbon is stored above surface. And then below the semicircle is showing what is stored below the surface. So if you look at those, like the wetlands, for example, wetlands may not have a lot of carbon above ground, but they are huge carbon sinks. So when we're talking about wetlands, think about mangrove forests and think about peat moss. Those are very dense carbon sinks, and it's all underground sequestering. Mangroves serve other purposes, right? They protect shorelines, so they help against sea erosion as well as sea level rise, but they are huge carbon sinks that we have. Grasslands even, right? You look at the goat on the upper there, he's eating a little bit of grass. Doesn't look like there's, it's not a big tree, it's just a little grass. But root systems for prairie grasses can go down 20 or 30 feet and way deeper and more expansive than just what you're seeing on the surface. So the soil and plants are huge carbon sinks that we can take advantage of. So let's look at carbon cycles, because you'll hear this, right? This is a natural cycle process. This has happened for years. We're just in a bump. So this is atmospheric carbon dioxide data that's coming out of observatories. And you'll notice on the right side is carbon dioxide parts per million, starting in the 330, 340 range. And this is starting from 1980. It's going to go towards present. And if you look at this, There's a normal cyclic nature. It's going up and down every year. That's because in the spring, when plants start to reproduce and the leaves come out, there's a drawdown in that year of carbon dioxide. They're growing. Then as fall happens and those plants are decomposing their leaves and things are dying off in the winter, there's an increase in CO2. That's a natural cycle every year that's happening. But you can look at the trend on this and it keeps going up and up and up. So we're seeing this trend go up over the last few years. And this is becoming significant. We're going into the 400, we're nearing 400 and getting up to the 420, 430 parts per million. And we're going to take a look. This graph is going to zoom out then, and we're going to look at how it's gone on for the last 500,000 years and seeing what the difference is. So obviously the last few years, this has been going on. How are they getting carbon dioxide measurements? Because no one was doing that 10,000 years ago. Well, they're using core samples of ice from Antarctica and Greenland. And you can do core samples of ice to look at carbon very much like a tree ring you could look at to see what the weather was like that year, what was the growth cycle going on. So snow that was falling in Antarctica and snow in Greenland is trapped in those each year. And they can look at carbon dioxide levels based on that atmospheric snow that landed that year. And so that's how they're getting this data and understanding how these levels have changed over time. So you can see where we were today, all the way on the top far side of that graph. As we start to go back 50,000 years, 100,000 years, 200,000 years, you can see that the carbon dioxide levels have had a natural cycle. They have been going up and down, but that has been ranging from like 200 to maybe 300 parts per million of carbon dioxide. And now we're up, in the 400s. So if we look at that and then we compare that and say, all right, is this truly just carbon dioxide going up and down? What does that matter? If you look at the left side of the graph here, this is comparing in that same that we just saw, carbon dioxide levels to methane levels, as well as temperature. And if you can look, carbon dioxide in blue goes up and down. Methane follows that up and down in green, almost the same, as does temperature. So temperature, methane, and carbon dioxide correlate with each other over the last 500,000 years in a cyclic nature. So when people say this is cyclic, they are correct that there are cyclic natures of carbon in our atmosphere. But we have now shifted and gone way beyond where we have in the last 500,000 years. But let's take a look even beyond that, right? So if we take 500,000 years, we're going to go back 500 million years. So what we see on the right side of this was what we just covered. We saw the cyclic nature in the 500,000 years ago. But let's look back, what was going on this planet, right? If we think of this planet a long time ago, it was tons of gas and heat and energy, and things were just stormy, right? As a primordial soup, as some people will describe. And carbon dioxide levels and temperatures went up and down. So on this, the dashed line is carbon dioxide levels. The solid line is temperatures above 1850, 1890s temperatures. So it's a degrees above or below. But we're looking at that and things varied, right? Volcanic activity was happening. We started then in 500, 300 million years ago. We started to have more plant life, dinosaurs, sea creatures. Things were starting to grow and not just be a volcanic planet with no life. So as life started, we were still a hot primordial soup with, rainforest going all the way to each poles, and there wasn't big ice sheets anywhere. As volcanic activity starts to decrease, as algae starts to grow in the oceans, and then those algae would die and fall to the bottom of the ocean, that became our future, our current oil and natural gas came from that. Those algae took a lot of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Dinosaurs, the trees, those plants settled and died, and that became coal. And that took a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere, and they started sequestering that carbon dioxide in the form of dead animals and dead organic matter that became our fossil fuels, but that settled and went into our planet, in a sense, stored. That started to decrease our carbon dioxide levels, and those started to come down until we start to see that cyclic pattern happening about 1 million years ago. So understanding where all that, carbon went, the carbon was there. You're right. This is not the highest level this planet has ever seen of carbon dioxide. Totally agree. And it's understanding that that was a different time than what we're at now, and where all that carbon came from and where it's sequestered. So now it was all under the planet, and now we're re-releasing the carbon that did exist in that planet a long time ago. To understand, like, okay, carbon dioxide is going up and down. We now have temperature that seems to be going up and down. How is this working? How are the greenhouse gases and all of this going together? Well, we think of Earth as kind of like an energy budget. So there's energy that comes in and energy that's released off this planet all the time. Solar radiation comes in. Some of that solar radiation is reflected by our atmosphere. Some of it's reflected by the surface of the Earth, and some is absorbed. Then our surface of our planet exudes some energy, and a lot of that gets reflected back by greenhouse gases. Some of it escapes in the form of thermals or latent heat or atmosphere and clouds. They release some energy as well. But energy in and energy out of our planet is what's going to determine how our planet warms or doesn't warm. And so when we think of energy, right, we think of that as temperature. So energy is a heat source. And so as this balance gets out of balance, we change, in a sense, are energizing our planet. We're putting more energy into the system than we're able to maintain, right? So if we look at a normal stable balance, the incoming solar energy is equal to what the planet releases, and we stay in a normal cycle of carbon dioxide, and we don't have extremes of weather or rising temperatures. Now we're out of balance because there's more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. They're not allowing that energy to escape the planet. They're keeping it in the planet. So our climate is becoming energized. And as that energy comes in, it's got to go somewhere, right? It doesn't just stay in the atmosphere. So where does it go? It's going in the ocean. Like the ocean takes on 91% of this extra energy. Ice. When ice takes it on in Greenland and Iceland, they start to melt, right? That energy is turning into heat. Lands are getting hotter. The atmosphere is getting warmer. So this energy imbalance is leading to a climatized or an energized climate that we're experiencing. So we think of energy as temperature. People are like, well, there's still cold days. There's still hot days. Absolutely. Because if you look at the average day temperature, any time in the history of our planet, it's an average. It's a bell curve, right? This year to next year, the year after that, the chance of it being on average is pretty good. But you could have a colder day and you could have a warmer day. That's very much in the probability for that temperature. But we're shifting the overall temperature to getting warmer. So the bell curve is shifting to the right as our planet is energizing. This still will have cold days, but there's going to be a lot less of them. There's going to be a lot more hot days, and there's going to be even more extreme hot days. And if you think about this too, perceptually, people have a difficulty with this because they see a cold front come in, and the cold front comes in, and they're like, man, that was really cold. But when a cold front comes in, it lasts for 2-3 days and then moves on. When a heat front moves in, or you have a heat wave, that's lasting for 7 to 10 days. So it's a lot more days of actual heat than cold, but people equate them as one event or one event. So perceptually, that we see things a little bit differently. And tomorrow we'll talk about extreme weather, and one of the meteorologists, Tom Dang's, going to hit on this. But the concept of how we perceive heat and cold and rain and forecasting is important. But overall, we're getting to hotter days. So what are the effects that we're seeing on the planet from these increased temperatures? Well, as we were saying, the oceans are absorbing it. The ice is absorbing it. So we're leading to sea ice that's melting, Antarctic ice and glacier ice melting. The sea levels are rising because of this melting. You're getting sea surface temperatures that are increasing, leading to algae blooms and other problems for plant life and animal life in the oceans. Your oceans are acidifying. And we think about, what do you mean with acidification? Well, carbon dioxide is an acid. We think about that in medicine, right? If I'm in my respiratory acid-base cycle, I blow off carbon dioxide, I am blowing off an acid. So carbon dioxide is acidifying our oceans, which then leads to death of coral, which they are releasing more carbon when they are dying. Our air temperatures are going up. As we talked about, we're having more hot days, less cold days, and there's increased episodes of extreme weather, whether it's floods or fires or thunderstorms or droughts. And this can affect different areas, right? So we talk about like sea ice melting and sea levels rising. Certain areas, and I'll hit on this a little bit later, are affected more. So even maybe, long term, if we melted all of our ice, predictions would say that would lead to maybe 2% of all of our water is stored in ice right now. So if that was all melted, Maryland may go up 2 feet of water levels, but Guam may go up 3 feet, and the Manila, Philippines may go up 4 feet. And we'll talk about why different areas may have different effects of sea level rise.
Is this
And
what
this
they mean by acid rain? Like this is the process they're talking about?
exactly, right? So when we talk about acid rain, carbon dioxide and like sulfur and sulfites, when mixed with water, come in the form of acid. So that's where you're getting that. So all of these become simple acids, right? Calcium, not calcium, but like basically you're getting hydrocarbonic acid, if that makes sense. Does that help, David?
Yeah, it does.
Cool. Thanks for the question. So we look at like this and we say, well, is the planet warming the same everywhere? And it's not. So this is going from 1850 to current day, looking at warming locations throughout the planet, red being warmer than average and blue being colder than average. And when we look at the warming trends, we're seeing it's more disproportionately in the northern hemispheres. And some of the question would be, why is this an issue? Well, in the northern hemispheres is where a large percentage of ice is, whether it's in Greenland or glacial ice. Also, those areas and land masses have large amounts of snow ice over the winter. Ice being white reflects a lot of the energy, as opposed to the blue oceans or green or brown land sources, which absorb a lot more energy. So we're losing surface area of the planet that reflects energy, and we're increasing areas that absorb more energy. So that becomes an issue. A second part of the issue is when these areas are being affected with temperature changes, the people living in those areas, because most people do live in the northern hemisphere, as most of our land is in the northern hemisphere on this planet, those infrastructure was not built for the high temperatures. A lot of buildings there do not have air conditioning. A lot of buildings were just thermal barriers. They would get through the summer with just a thick, wall, and that would be good. But when your temperature is getting to 90, 100, 110 degrees Fahrenheit, the thickness of the building is not keeping you cool for those periods of time. So it's affecting that population and infrastructure and putting a new stress on it that now they have to require AC units. That requires increased energy, which requires increased fossil fuel, which promotes the cycle even more. So there is an disproportionate warming in areas, which is affecting our planet even more. So before we get on to the health, any other questions right now? Cool. So going back to the first diagram we kind of hit on, the 4 major Earth systems that are kind of changing. Increased carbon dioxide levels, we're getting increased temperatures because of that. The increased temperatures are energizing the planet, is causing extreme weather, and that extreme weather is leading to sea level rise. So these are like our 4 basic tenets. And if we understand these effects, let's see if we can tie those into health effects. So how is extreme weather affecting health, right? So if we think about extreme weather, think of it as kind of like a force multiplier in the medically vulnerable. So we talk about medically vulnerable. You're going to hear this theme over and over again. It's those with socioeconomic status, lower socioeconomic status, those with pre-existing illness, those of extremes of age, and those of communities of color. So the poor, the sick, the elderly, and the communities of color are most affected, especially by extreme weather. They don't have resiliency and are more vulnerable to these kind of effects. So whether that's a flood, whether that's a drought, whether that's an extreme rainstorm, All of this can lead to water contamination, property loss, infrastructure damage, and they don't have the ability to handle that. And whether that infrastructure or property loss, this may seem like, oh, it's not us, right? It's there was a storm in Puerto Rico. How does that affect me? Puerto Rico produces a lot of IV fluids and medical supplies. And so storms in Puerto Rico lead to health complications for us here in the United States because we run into IV fluid shortages and other problems. So there's an interconnectedness based on our global economy that infrastructure damage or property loss or wildfires in one area, it's not just isolated there. Wildfire smoke blows across the country. And we've seen that, right? The Canadian wildfires recently were affecting air quality in New York City. There was nowhere near New York City where the wildfire was, but the smoke is moving through the jet stream and can hit other places. So there is an interconnectedness of everyone's health based on extreme events throughout the planet. Whether you think there's a direct tie or not, it's definitely there. And all of these effects can lead to whether it's infectious disease with like waterborne illnesses or just direct, right? A big storm, the building collapsed and crushed me. I died of trauma versus I lost my house and now I have mental trauma because I'm going to PTSD. I can't afford things for my family, things like that. If we look at sea level rise and we say, well, how is that working? I kind of was saying some areas of sea level change are different in different parts. And that's because of a couple things. So one, our Antarctica actually has its own gravitational force. So it pulls sea levels towards it because it's so, the ice sheet there is so thick. But the other thing is just our currents and wind movement usually blows from east to west. So as things blow from east to west, almost like water on a lake, will be lower on one side that the wind is coming from and higher where the wind is hitting. So the water is moving, say across the Pacific. So the west coast of the United States will be less affected by sea level rise than the east coast, just as the Southeast Asia is going to be more affected than, say, the west coast of Africa. And that's just with water moving across. The issue with sea level rise is affecting a significant percentage of our population, right? A lot of people live on the coast. We did that. We migrated there because of trade and people want to be near water. So people have been living coastally for a long period of time. So in the United States, some of the most vulnerable cities include Miami, New Orleans, New York City, Tampa, and Boston. Those would most likely be affected. And worldwide, you're looking at things like Ho Chi Minh City, Shenzhen, Guangzhou in China, and Mumbai in India. And these are large cities that are under threat from sea level rise. And this may lead to a displacement of 50 to 100 million people by the year 2100. If we look at temperature rising and how is that related to health? Well, there's a couple things, right? The simple one is temperature goes up, more heat-related illness, right? They come into the ER, they call their doctor, oh, it's too hot, I'm hot, we deal with heat stroke. But there's other more insidious causes of temperature rise, right? So a Harvard study looked at this, and for every single degree of Celsius temperature rise in the summer, 3 to 4% death rate increase in elderly because they have chronic medical conditions that are exacerbated by this, whether it's heart disease or diabetes or chronic lung disease. They're at increased risk for death just from temperature rise. Another more insidious thing, right? We can look at vector-borne diseases. So malaria used to be non-existent in Europe. It was there and then it was gone, but mosquitoes are now carrying dengue and malaria back into Europe because the temperatures are rising there and they're expanding their environment where they live. There's even been a malaria case reported in Alaska because of temperature rise with mosquitoes. So these are things we have to worry about and think about. The other thing is an urban heat island effect. So we talked about that a little, or someone mentioned that as a question, kind of understanding how that works. So the urban heat island effect is occurring because of us migrating as a species, right? We used to be a very rural-based, population. And then we started moving into our cities during the Industrial Revolution for jobs and other services. And we get to about 30% of our population living in cities. Now it's 50% of the world's population is living in cities, and up to 60% in the next 100 years. So when people are moving to cities, you've got to build things. The infrastructure goes in. You have to hardscape. You have to put in more concrete buildings. And all of that hardscape, hard structures is replacing grass and trees and green space. The grass and trees and green space lead to a cooling effect, because when the evening comes on, the sun is not out, those are much cooler. And they can be cooler in a rural area by up to 3.5 degrees Celsius than in an urban setting in the same location. But that heat is trapped, right? It's trapped into roadways, it's trapped into buildings and sidewalks. That hardscape sucks in that heat and then re-releases it during night when it's cooler. So that leads to an urban heat island effect, which can cause problems for people. And this, again, we talk about resiliency and who's more resilient: the poor, the elderly, communities of color. They can't maybe afford their AC unit. They can't get to a cool space with a pool. They don't have reflective roofing to decrease that heat effect. So that heat can really affect them more so. Overall, this is leading to a large interconnectedness. That's what we're trying to show. How is climate affecting health? Well, health systems, our social or structural determinants of health, and our ecologic or climate determinants of health are all interrelated. So whether it's just an infection or extreme heat or breathing difficulties, all of our systems are interconnected, and we need to understand that working on one aspect can lead to benefits on the other. But this is just like a sick, diseased patient, right? And if we look at it and understand their process, we'll be able to treat it. So what's going on in Arizona? Like, what are our big things, right? What do we see? Well, heat, I think we've all kind of pointed to that, right? Heat is a major issue in Arizona. I went to a recent heat summit where members from like the state and the local groups, even like, community food bank and some of our bus systems and transportation systems and city planners are all trying to look at this and figure out how we can be more resilient against heat and heat-related illnesses going forward. So this is a big push in the state. And I believe the state office the governor's office just created a heat officer for the state of Arizona. So this is getting a lot more attention in our state. And that heat, when we talk about resiliency of humans, is resiliency of our environment as well, right? Trees with extreme weather and drought and long heat are less resilient to forest fires. Forest fires are a natural cycle, but if you add a drought, like a dried out tree because of weather, and then you throw on extreme heat in front of it, you're going to get more forest fires. And we're seeing these that are lasting longer, more intense, not just here in our state, but we're getting states surrounding that the smoke is coming in. So wildfires is a big issue here. Air pollution. City of Phoenix is one of the top 10 air pollution, and I think even top 5 most polluted airs of cities in the country. So this is a big issue that's going on. Again, air pollution, major sources of greenhouse gases in our state are electricity and transportation. Longer growing seasons that are warmer with more carbon dioxide leads to more plant growth, which is good, right? That's good, but it has an allergen effect. And so some of our mesquite trees and palo verdes are having longer growing seasons. So the allergies and allergen effects in our state are increasing and for longer duration. And as we talked before too, water is a big issue. And water in a desert, you need that for life. And here, whether our reserves are decreasing, which they are, the cutbacks are becoming more of an issue going forward. And then who gets the water? Does it go to agriculture? Does it go to cities? Is other states taking Colorado River water and we're fighting other states? So it's an interesting concept, but water is a big issue. And then that can lead to scarcity and decreased ability for heat resilience as well. So complex thing, right? This is like your patient with diabetes who went into diabetic ketoacidosis and they got a pneumonia, and now you've got to figure out their acid-base status. And, oh my gosh, they're super sick and super complicated. Absolutely. The planet is sick. And like a sick patient, there'll be good days and there'll be bad days. But this is something that we're starting to understand. And so by understanding and taking a look at the complexity of this and the interconnectedness and the interrelatedness of all these issues, just like you do in medicine, you can come up with a treatment plan and you can come up with a diagnosis and know what to do. And the good news is there is hope. We have all the technology we need today. We have all the resources we need today. We just have to execute. And so let's start looking through, and people want to do this. You are not alone. There are a large percentage of people who want to make a difference. It's just how. So a couple more things. So again, don't feel alone. What percentage of adults in the United States think corporations should do more to address global warming? 70%. 70% of Americans want to do this. What percent of Americans want to regulate carbon dioxide as a pollutant? 74%. So almost 3 in 4, right? And we start thinking like, well, is that a lot of people? Heck yeah, it's a lot of people. You know, you think about a constitutional amendment, you got to get 2/3. This is more than a constitutional amendment, but yet we haven't moved on it, right? What about generating on public lands renewable energy? 79%, almost 80% of the population wants to generate renewable energy on public lands. That's big numbers. Now, what about teaching? Should we be teaching our children this? Yes. And 75% of people want your children, and you guys are all showing up here, and we're all part of the teaching process, but we're going to teach about the consequences and harms and solutions of global warming. This is so important. This is probably one of the biggest issues. And if we can start to get young people involved and young people learning about this from a grade level, so when you're graduating high school, this becomes, oh yeah, I already know all about global warming. I know about the effects. I know about solutions. Everyone's starting at that. That would be huge, right? But there's a disconnect. Why? Like with many other issues, right? If we don't talk about this, it doesn't come up to the forefront, right? Why do stroke centers work? Why does trauma centers work? Why do people put sepsis alerts out there? Because if you pay attention to any disease, it gets better. The results get better. Your outcomes get better. If we start to pay attention to the disease and talk about it, it will get better. So we have to be part of the discussion. We have to bring this up. We have to bring this up like we talk about the patriarchy. We have to be talking about this like Black Lives Matter. We have to be talking about this as an issue that exists. If we want to talk about the caste system, we can break it down. But until we talk about it, we're not going to move forward as much. So having this part of your normal conversation, it doesn't have to be a political decision. This is a normal conversation about, yeah, this was kind of interesting. This was cool. This is what's going on. Make it part of your life, and accepting it is huge. So how do we do that, right? How do we do this? Is this an individual action? Is it a policy action? Is it both? Right? So let's break down kind of how we can, some of the solutions and things that we can do. Well, individually, you can only do so much, right? I can only do so many things on a daily basis to fight climate change. But one of the most important things you can do is vote. And you vote for people that are putting in policies that will line up with what you want. Educating yourself, which is what you guys are doing, and then serving as an example, right? I have friends that are like, oh, I got to use cloth napkins today because Brian's coming over and we can't use the disposable plates. That's fine. Like, right? I am somehow, they're like, oh, I didn't want to offend you. I'm like, no. The fact that you're thinking about it because I showed up, that's great. So now you're conscious of it. And then maybe you'll find that the cloth napkins are better than the paper napkins. And it's like, oh, well, that's cool. So serving as an example can be a multiplier, right? You can affect 1 or 2 people. Maybe they affect 1 or 2 people. And then individuals start to become a groundswell, and lots of people making the same decision can be significantly impactful. The top 5 things you can do as an individual is 1, less children, 2, fly less, 3, a plant-based diet, 4, drive less or use alternative transportation, and 5, create your own energy. So those are the top 5 things individuals can do. Now, are any of us going to do that tomorrow? No, those are, sometimes those are longer term issues. But you can have those as plans that you want to do as an individual to make that decision. And there's definitely financial benefits for each of those decisions as well. So it's a multiplicative there. Policy-wise, again, voting will get your policy actions, but you also have to like write up, show up, call. The fact that you're here and you're interested is huge, right? You are showing interest, and it can just be signing a petition for something. It can be going to a local working group on some topic, but it's engaging with your community. Maybe your policy is small as like, we had a policy for our Cub Scouts and we said, we're not providing plastic water bottles. Everyone brings a reusable water bottle, and that was the policy. It wasn't written down. We just said that's what we're doing. But even for a policy for a small community organization or your larger work organization or something else, you can make those to make differences. Now, is anyone here a member of Arizona Health Professionals for Climate Action? Cool. So if you want to join, a simple thing you can do today, there's a QR code, you can zap that and join us. Free organization, you'll get an email from me once a month, but you'll hear about what's going on and ways to get engaged. So doing little things like that, right? Join an organization that you get to learn about stuff, find ways for engagement, simple things to do, but it's a way to get engaged. And then you can, as you get more time and you get more energy, you can do more things. So we look at, this is from the Lancet, which was really nice. How do we as individuals go about this, right? Well, it's hard sometimes as an individual to do something, but we all have resources, right? We have skills, we have social capital, political capital, financial capital that we can use, and we can take those resources and come up with a strategy and aim for a target. And that target can be broken down into small little targets. We don't have to fix the world or make the whole world on renewable energy tomorrow, but maybe we do something much smaller. And we're going to do this by using storytelling. We're going to relate to emotional component because the hearts and minds help with people. So people love hearing stories about patients or your patients, and it's someone that you had or a loved one, right? That helps you get to your target. You're going to use specific tactics to try to get there, and hopefully you get a win. And when you do get that win, that's going to give you more hope, and it's going to help cycle you a little bit more. If you don't win, though, just use it as a learning experience. Reach out to others, talk to other people, because if you don't, then you'll feel lost, and you will have like, oh, I don't want to do this. It's all hopeless. I should never try again. But there's a lot of us who, even if we don't win every time, we're making steps, and you want to have it as a targeted approach. And this can be simple in terms of like looking at your own, can I do on a micro level, individual, I can reduce my carbon footprint. Okay, I can try to do that, right? I can make this little switch today and try to do that. To, things that may span from the macro level to the micro, let's talk about, empowering women and girls for education and reproductive right and family planning and leadership, because women do better and they have better sustainable activity. They're better at managing farms. They're better at managing companies, and they're better at managing leadership positions. So why aren't we engaging with women more on these issues and bringing them to the forefront? How can we do things in a financial manner, right? We can span all levels with financial planning. Maybe I divest from fossil fuel companies and invest in more renewable sources if I'm a company. Or as an individual, you can do that same component too. So there's ways that we can attack targets at different times and with different resources to get outcomes. And I know it just comes down to time and money, right? Time and money. We all wish we had more time, and you guys wish you had more money. You will get more money at some point, but everyone still is getting paid a little bit. So when you vote with your dollar and where you put your dollar, maybe you buy the organic apple instead of the regular apple because you know that it will use less pesticides and fertilizer, which is a fossil fuel, which causes damage to the environment, right? So you're looking to do that. But all of these things that we look to do and treat the planet are going to have good outcomes for our patients. And this diagram is kind of showing, like, if we make a healthy planet, we're going to have healthy people, right? If we get people cycling or using or walking more, instead of driving their cars, they're going to have better outcomes, right? If we can get a zero carbon electricity, if we can decrease emissions in indoor air quality and decrease outdoor air pollution, we will get better outcomes for our patients. A plant-rich diet is going to have lower cholesterol levels. I don't have to take the medicine I need every day. If I get more trees around me and reforesting areas, I'm going to be a lot happier, right? Where do people go on vacations? They go to water and nature. Why is that? Because we got to reconnect, right? We got to reconnect with our roots. We drop things away, and that leads to a better mental health illness. Well, why can't we bring more nature into around us all the time? So we feel like we're on a vacation on a regular basis. So these are kind of aspects that as we work on these solutions, we're going to be helping our patients. Our patients are going to have better outcomes as we work on the planet solutions. So overall today, hopefully you guys have taken away a few things, right? We've talked about carbon dioxide levels. We've talked about greenhouse gases, the relation to temperature rise, this energized planet that we're seeing. We're talking about who's being affected most: communities of color, elderly, poor, young, those with pre-existing medical condition. We've talked about, even though it's bad, it's real, and experts agree, and we did it, there's still a lot of hope. And we understand where other people are coming from, and we're going to have avenues to engage with them and not let them feel hopeless, not let them say it's fine, we don't need to do anything about it. But hopefully this is going to be a start for this course, that we can then take this knowledge and ask some more questions and get deeper into some of these topics so you guys have a better understanding and going forward. Any questions?
I have a question. Why do we think that so many people are flocking to cities, hence the worsening heat islands and stuff? What is the pull for that?
So migration-wise, over periods of time, right, there's population initially moved to cities as part of the Industrial Revolution was the first push. We left from an agrarian and they went to cities. We then in the 50s and 60s, as like transportation systems and freeways came on board, people wanted to go away from the city. They wanted to go to the suburb and be in their, their country estate and stuff. And then now we're having a re-urbanization effect. So people want to move back into cities, and they're doing it for services. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. Populations are moving for jobs and services. So if there's better services and jobs in a city, that's where they're going to move. We're seeing, I think it'll be interesting with post-COVID, and now as people are able to work more remotely, there was an initial push where people were going back maybe to their hometown in rural Kansas, and they can work from home and they don't have to move to Boston because that's where their company's located. So there may be some of that fluctuation occurring, but it really becomes a goods and services, and then where they can afford to live. And so, migration patterns now are based on costs, like in the United States, but we also have a huge influx of immigrants too that are continuing, right? There's a huge migration worldwide into Europe, United States, and other countries. So if we look at it from a very small perspective versus very large, it really comes down to job services are kind of the two major determinants where people are moving. But for cities, it's really going to come down to reimagining the city, right? How do I densify? Like, so in the United States, we're probably a third the density of Europe. So Europe has a much more, right? There is a lot more like 2 or 3 story buildings that people live in, whereas we've kind of had this urban sprawl where we're spreading out and we're not as dense. So some of the urban planners are looking at, can you re-densify? Can you maybe put some like 2-story, 3-story buildings with nice, maybe 3 or 4 bedroom places that people would want to live, but without spreading out. So you can bring goods and services together. Because if the more you spread out, then you've got to have transportation, right? If I can walk to my grocery store and walk to my gym and do those things, I don't care as much about a car or transportation issues. But if I have to drive 30 minutes to work, and everything's far away, yes, I've got to drive my car. I've got to use transportation. I'm going to burn more fossil fuels, right? You got to keep that road and maintain that. And then that creates more hardscape. So because it's just such an interrelated cycle on on how these kind of spin up. Does that help answer that?
Yeah, thank you.